The cold wind blew through the busy streets of the city as Liam, a young homeless boy, pulled his thin jacket tighter around his small body. His stomach growled, reminding him that he hadn't eaten anything since the previous day. He walked along the sidewalk, his eyes searching for anything he could eat. Liam had been living on the streets for months now. Life had not been kind to him. His mother used to have a job, but after losing it unfairly, they lost their home too. She had fallen sick, and now she was lying in a small shelter, too weak to work. Liam had to find food, not just for himself but for her too. As he walked past a fancy restaurant, the warm smell of delicious food filled his nose. His mouth watered. He stopped near a trash bin, hoping to find something fresh enough to eat. He wasn't proud of it, but hunger left him no choice. He peeked inside, searching through paper bags and half-eaten food. Suddenly, he heard laughter and a clinking of plates. He looked up through the restaurant's large glass windows. Inside, people sat at beautiful tables, eating expensive meals. The waiters moved quickly, serving food with bright smiles. Everyone looked happy. That was when he noticed him, a man who looked important. He was wearing a sharp suit and had a strong, confident face. Even from outside, Liam could tell that this man was not just rich. He was powerful. Sitting across from him was a woman, dressed in expensive clothes and sparkling jewelry. She was smiling, but something about her expression felt strange. Liam had a habit of watching people. Living on the streets had taught him to read faces, to understand who was kind and who wasn't. The woman looked beautiful, but her eyes were cold. She didn't smile with warmth. Her smile looked like she was hiding something. Then Liam saw something that made his heart race. The woman, thinking no one was watching, quickly reached into her purse and took out a tiny bottle. She glanced around, making sure no one was looking. Then, with careful hands, she poured a few drops of something into the man's food. She stirred it gently, still smiling. Liam's breath caught in his throat. What was she doing? That wasn't normal. He looked back at the man, who was busy on his phone. He had no idea what had just happened. The waiter came over, placing the plate in front of him. The man smiled and picked up his fork. Liam's heart pounded. He didn't know who this man was, but he knew one thing. He was in danger. Without thinking, Liam ran toward the entrance. He had to stop him before it was too late. Liam's heart raced as he pushed through the restaurant doors. The warmth inside hit his cold skin, but he didn't care. His eyes were fixed on the man sitting at the table, about to take a bite of his food. "Stop!" Liam shouted, his voice shaking but loud enough for everyone to hear. Heads turned, and the room fell silent. The man looked up in surprise, his fork stopping just inches from his mouth. His deep brown eyes met Liam's, filled with confusion. The woman sitting across from him gasped, placing a hand on her chest as if shocked. "What is this? Who let this boy in?" she said, her voice sharp. Liam didn't care about her reaction. He pointed at the plate. "Don't eat that. She put something in your food." His voice was desperate. He knew no one would believe a homeless boy like him, but he had to try. The room filled with murmurs. Some guests frowned, while others looked at each other in confusion. A waiter stepped forward, ready to remove Liam from the restaurant. "This is ridiculous," the woman snapped, shaking her head. "He's just a street kid causing trouble." She turned to the man. "Richard, don't listen to him. He probably just wants attention or money." Richard Montgomery, one of the richest men in the city, studied Liam carefully. His sharp gaze scanned the boy's face, then shifted to the plate in front of him. Something about Liam's eyes, so full of fear, made him pause. Liam took a shaky breath. "I saw her. She poured something in your food when you weren't looking." Richard's expression darkened slightly, but he remained calm. He placed his fork down slowly. "That's a serious accusation," he said in a deep, measured voice. "Are you sure?" "Yes." Liam nodded firmly. "I saw it with my own eyes." The woman forced a laugh. Are we really listening to this nonsense? This child is lying. He's probably trying to scam us. She turned to a waiter. Get him out of here right now. A waiter hesitated but stepped forward to grab Liam's arm. Liam struggled, trying to stay. Please, I'm not lying, he begged. Just then, another waiter, a young man who had been watching quietly, hesitated before stepping closer to Richard. He slipped a small folded napkin onto the table and whispered, "Sir, you might want to check your food." Richard's eyes narrowed. He noticed how the young waiter avoided looking at the woman. Something was wrong. The woman noticed too. Her grip on the table tightened. This is absurd. Are you really going to believe a dirty street boy over your own wife? Richard didn't respond right away. Instead, he picked up his plate and, without a word, switched it with the woman's. He pushed the new plate toward her. "If there's nothing wrong," he said calmly, "why don't you take the first bite?" The woman's face turned pale as Richard pushed the plate toward her. For a moment, she didn't move. The entire restaurant had fallen silent, with every pair of eyes fixed on her. Lion held his breath, hoping Richard would finally see the truth. She let out a nervous laugh, trying to act normal. "Richard, don't be ridiculous. Why would I need to prove anything? This is insulting," she said, forcing a smile, but her hands trembled slightly as she pushed the plate away. Richard's expression didn't change. He folded his arms and leaned back in his chair. "It's simple," he said. "If the food is safe, you should have no problem eating it." The woman glanced around, realizing that everyone was watching. She knew she couldn't refuse outright without looking guilty. Taking a deep breath, she reached for the fork with a shaky hand. Liam could see the hesitation in her eyes. She picked up a small piece of food, brought it close to her lips, then suddenly dropped the fork with a loud clank against the plate. I'm not hungry anymore," she said quickly. "This whole situation has ruined my appetite." A few people in the restaurant exchanged whispers. The tension in the air was thick. Richard's face darkened. He wasn't a man who trusted easily, but he had never imagined questioning his own wife like this. Liam saw his chance. He stepped forward again, his voice strong. "See, she won't eat it because she knows what's in it." The woman turned to Richard, her eyes pleading. "Are you really going to listen to this street child? He's just trying to trick you." Before Richard could respond, the young waiter who had slipped him the note cleared his throat. "Sir," he said hesitantly, "if you'd like, we can test the food in the kitchen." His voice was quiet, but firm. The woman's face tightened. "Enough of this nonsense," she snapped. "I am your wife, Richard. You're embarrassing me in front of everyone." Richard ignored her and nodded at the waiter. "Take it," he ordered. The woman's breathing became uneven as the waiter carefully picked up the plate and walked toward the kitchen. Liam could see the panic rising in her eyes. I can't believe this," she whispered, looking at Richard with disbelief. "You're doubting me." Richard remained silent, his sharp eyes studying her every move. He had built his empire by trusting his instincts, and right now, his instincts were telling him something was very wrong. A few moments later, the restaurant manager returned, looking pale. He leaned in and whispered something to Richard. Richard's eyes darkened. His jaw tightened. Slowly, he turned back to his wife. Liam knew, at that moment, that the truth was about to come out. Richard sat still, his fingers tapping lightly on the table. The manager had whispered only a few words, but they were enough to confirm what he feared. His wife had done something terrible. The woman, realizing something was wrong, forced a nervous smile. "What did he say, Richard?" she asked sweetly, though her voice trembled slightly. Richard took a deep breath. "The food was tested," he said, his voice calm but firm. "And there was something in it. Something that shouldn't be there." Gasps echoed around the restaurant. The guests exchanged shocked looks, and some even pulled out their phones, sensing that something big was happening. The woman's face turned pale, but she quickly tried to cover it up. Tea, that's impossible, she stammered. Someone must have made a mistake. Maybe the kitchen mixed up ingredients. She turned to the manager. Tell him. It's just a mistake, right? The manager looked uncomfortable. Ma'am, the substance found in the food is not something used in our kitchen. It had to be added afterward. Liam felt a strange mix of relief and fear. Finally, someone believed him. But what would happen next? Richard's expression didn't change. His sharp eyes studied his wife's face. Do you have anything to say? He asked. The woman's hands clenched into fists. Her perfect mask was slipping. For a moment, she looked around the restaurant, as if trying to find a way out of the situation. Then, she turned her cold gaze toward Liam. This is because of him, she snapped, pointing at Liam. This filthy street boy is ruining everything. He must have done something to the food to set me up. Liam's heart pounded. I didn't do anything. I just saw what you did and tried to stop it. The guests murmured louder. Some of them had been recording the entire conversation, and now more and more people were turning against the woman. Richard's face darkened. Enough, he said, his voice quiet but dangerous. You've said enough. The woman's face twisted with frustration. Richard, you can't seriously believe this child over me. I am your wife. Richard slowly stood up. His tall frame cast a shadow over the table. And yet you tried to harm me. His voice was low, controlled, but filled with disappointment. I don't know why you did this, but I will find out. Tears welled up in the woman's eyes, but this time, they were not from sadness. They were from anger. She had been caught, and she knew it. Just then, the restaurant doors swung open, and 2 security guards entered, followed by a police officer. The manager had already made the call. As the officer walked toward the table, Liam let out a shaky breath. The truth had come out, but something told him this was just the beginning. The restaurant was completely silent as the police officer approached the table. The woman's hands trembled, but she quickly masked her fear with anger. She stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. This is ridiculous, she shouted. I am Richard Montgomery's wife. You can't treat me like this. The officer remained calm. Ma'am, we just need to ask you a few questions. His voice was polite but firm. We have received a report that something was added to the food. Richard crossed his arms and stared at his wife. They won't need to ask many questions. The truth is already clear. Liam watched carefully. He could see the panic growing in the woman's eyes. She was trying to act confident, but it wasn't working anymore. The guests were whispering, and several of them were still recording. The truth was out, and she had nowhere to hide. I did nothing wrong, she insisted. I would never hurt my own husband. This is all a misunderstanding. She pointed at Liam again. It's because of him. This dirty child made up a story, and now everyone believes him. Liam felt a lump in his throat, but he stood his ground. I only told the truth, he said firmly. You didn't expect anyone to see what you did, but I did. Richard glanced at Liam, then back at his wife. His face was unreadable, but his eyes were cold. You had a choice to tell the truth, he said, but instead you kept lying. The officer nodded. Ma'am, we need you to come with us. We'll sort everything out at the station. The woman's eyes widened. You're arresting me. No, this isn't happening. She turned to Richard, her voice desperate. Richard, say something. I'm your wife. You know I love you. Richard shook his head. If that were true, I wouldn't be standing here right now, alive, because of this boy. He placed a firm hand on Liam's shoulder. Tears welled up in the woman's eyes, but there was no love in them, only frustration. You'll regret this, Richard, she whispered, her voice filled with bitterness. The officer signaled the guards, who stepped forward. The woman hesitated but finally realized she had no choice. With slow steps, she followed the officer toward the exit. The entire restaurant watched as she was led away, her expensive heels clicking against the floor. The moment she was gone, A heavy silence filled the air. Then, slowly, people started whispering again. Some shook their heads in disbelief, while others glanced at Richard, waiting to see what he would do next. Richard turned to Liam. For the first time, his face softened. "What's your name, kid?" "Liam," he answered quietly. Richard nodded. "Well, Liam, I think we need to have a talk." Liam wasn't sure what was going to happen next, but one thing was clear. His life was about to change forever. Liam stood frozen as Richard looked at him. His mind was still trying to process everything that had just happened. Just an hour ago, he was searching for food. And now he had saved a billionaire's life. The whole restaurant was still buzzing with whispers, but all Liam could focus on was the tall man in front of him. Richard sighed and sat back down, rubbing his temples as if he had a headache. "Sit," he said, pulling out a chair next to him. Liam hesitated. He wasn't sure if he should, but something in Richard's voice told him it was okay. Slowly, he sat down, feeling out of place in such a fancy restaurant. A waiter, still looking shocked, approached the table. "Sir, would you like us to bring you something else?" Richard shook his head. "No, I've lost my appetite." Then he turned to Liam. "Are you hungry?" Liam's face burned with embarrassment, but his stomach growled before he could answer. Richard let out a small chuckle. "That settles it. Bring him whatever he wants." Liam's eyes widened. He had never been given a choice before. Usually, he ate whatever he could find. He swallowed nervously. "A sandwich, and maybe some juice," he said shyly. Richard nodded, and the waiter left quickly. Then Richard leaned forward, his expression serious. "Tell me, Liam, why were you outside the restaurant? Were you just passing by?" Liam hesitated. He had spent most of his life hiding his struggles from others, but something about Richard made him want to be honest. He lowered his gaze. "I was looking for food," he admitted. "I don't have a home." Richard's jaw tightened slightly. "Where do you stay?" Liam shrugged. "Sometimes in shelters, sometimes in alleyways. My mom is sick, and I try to find food for her." Richard studied him for a moment, then asked, "Where is she now?" "In a shelter, but it's not permanent. They don't let us stay too long." Liam sighed. "I don't know what to do." The waiter returned with the food, placing a plate in front of Liam. He stared at the warm sandwich, his mouth watering. "Go ahead," Richard said. Liam didn't need to be told twice. He took a big bite, feeling warmth spread through his empty stomach. It was the best thing he had eaten in a long time. Richard watched him for a while, then spoke again. "Liam, you saved my life today. If it weren't for you, I don't know what would have happened." His voice was thoughtful. "You have a good heart." Liam swallowed his food and looked up. "I just did what was right." Richard nodded, a small smile forming on his lips. "And because of that, I want to help you." Liam's heart skipped a beat. "Help me?" "Yes," Richard said firmly. "Starting now, your life is going to change." Liam's eyes widened in shock. He had never heard those words before. Someone wanted to help him. He wasn't sure if he should believe it. Life had taught him that nothing came easy. Richard leaned forward, his eyes serious but kind. "You saved my life, Liam. The least I can do is make sure you don't have to struggle anymore." Liam shifted in his seat. "But I don't understand. Why would you help me? I'm just a homeless kid." Richard sighed. "Because I know what it feels like to have nothing." Liam's mouth opened in surprise. "You? But you're a billionaire." Richard nodded. "I wasn't always. I grew up poor too. My parents worked hard, but sometimes we didn't even have enough food. I know what it's like to sleep in the cold, to feel invisible." His voice softened. "But someone helped me once. They gave me a chance, and that's why I am where I am today." Liam listened carefully. He had never imagined that someone like Richard had once struggled too. Richard continued, "And now, I want to do the same for you." Liam hesitated. He had learned not to trust people easily. Life on the streets had made him careful. "What kind of help?" he asked cautiously. Richard smiled slightly. "A real home, proper food, education, a future. I want to help your mother too. She won't have to stay in a shelter anymore." Liam's heart pounded. A home, a future. It sounded like a dream. "You'd really do that for us?" "Yes," Richard said firmly. "You saved my life. Now, let me change yours." Liam felt a lump in his throat. He had spent so many nights wondering if things would ever get better. Now it seemed like everything was about to change. But then, doubt crept in. "What if I mess up?" he asked quietly. "What if I'm not good enough?" Richard's expression softened. "Everyone makes mistakes, Liam. What matters is that you try. You have a good heart, and that's what's important." Liam took a deep breath. For the first time in a long time, he felt hope. Maybe, just maybe, life had something good in store for him after all. Richard stood up and placed a hand on Liam's shoulder. "Come on, let's go see your mother." Liam wiped his eyes quickly, not wanting to show how emotional he felt. He nodded and stood up. As they walked out of the restaurant, he realized that for the first time in years, he wasn't walking alone. His life was about to change forever. Liam walked beside Richard, his heart racing. He still couldn't believe this was happening. Just a few hours ago, he was outside, cold and hungry, watching people enjoy expensive meals. Now he was walking with one of the richest men in the city, and his life was about to change. As they arrived at the shelter, Liam felt nervous. He wasn't sure how his mother would react. Would she believe that someone wanted to help them? Would she think it was too good to be true? Richard noticed Liam's hesitation and gave him a reassuring nod. "It's going to be okay," he said. Liam took a deep breath and stepped inside. The shelter was quiet, with a few people sitting on old chairs, wrapped in blankets. He walked toward a small corner where his mother lay resting. She looked pale and weak, her breathing slow. "Mom," Liam said softly, kneeling beside her. "Mom, wake up." His mother's eyes fluttered open. When she saw Liam, she smiled weakly. "Liam, you're back," she whispered. "Did you find something to eat?" Liam's throat tightened. He had spent so many nights wishing he could bring her something more than scraps. But today was different. "Mom, I found someone," he said. "Someone who wants to help us." She looked confused, then noticed Richard standing behind Liam. Her eyes widened in shock. Mr. Montgomery," she whispered, struggling to sit up. Richard stepped forward. "Yes," he said gently. "And I believe we need to talk." Tears filled her eyes. I used to work for your company," she said. "But I was let go. After that, everything fell apart." Richard's expression darkened. "I know," he said, "and I just found out why. I'm truly sorry for what happened to you." He took a deep breath. "But I want to make it right." Liam's mother looked at him with disbelief. "What do you mean?" "I mean a new home, proper medical care, a fresh start," Richard said. "Not just for Liam, but for you too." Tears rolled down her cheeks. This can't be real," she whispered. "It is," Richard assured her. "Liam saved my life tonight. Now, I want to change yours." Liam held his mother's hand tightly, feeling warmth spread through his chest. For the first time in a long time, he saw hope in her eyes. Richard smiled. "Let's go home." Liam helped his mother up, and together, they walked out of the shelter. The cold night air didn't feel so harsh anymore. For the first time in years, Liam wasn't just surviving. He was stepping into a new life. A life filled with hope, love, and the chance to dream again.